Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Andre and I'm your bookworm. And today we are back on Book Chats. The theme of today is going to be my favorite category when I review books. And yes, we'll be talking about world building. Now, when I talk about world building, it's usually mostly focused in fantasy, which is the subgenre that I read the most. And when I consider world building, I consider majorly three big aspects of it. And of course, some of these also apply to other books that are not fantasy, like science fiction or just fiction in general. Others, not so much, but I'll just explain what each one is and what I consider a really good example in there with some authors, and also just to create a bit of a discussion here so that I can get more recommendations of good world buildings and just for people to tell me what do they think is a good world building. But anyways, the major three things that I look in world building are the magic systems, the world itself, and the history of the world. Now, it doesn't mean that an excellent book in terms of world building needs to have all of these three. Some of them really excel at one of them, and the other two are practically non existent, but it's still an amazing book in regards to world building. Others just ace on all three, and that makes them an even greater book. But instead of me being chatting here just about these three things, let me just get into it, talk about each one of them with some examples. All right, let's start with magic system because I think it is the easiest to explain. It's fantasy focused. Usually magic systems, they have a big range. We can go from being a very soft, high magic system like Lord of the Rings, where it's very hand wavy. Gandalf just does the spell and the spell does what he wants. There are pretty much no limitations to it. I mean, there are kind of some, but there are not hard rules like we see in the opposite side of the spectrum with hard magic, which is magic systems that are very limited. They have a lot of rules associated to them, and because of that, it creates a whole different dynamic. It's not a device to save heroes just willy-nilly like it does in soft magic systems, but at the same time, it does not have that mysticism that magic has sometimes. Of course, it's kind of a trade-off. You can't get one and get the other one at the same time. I mean, sometimes you can, but it's very, very rare for an author to be able to do that. But then again, both of them, and not saying that soft systems are bad, I still enjoy them, but they really need to be made really well to make sure that it's not just hand wave and suddenly everything's solved kind of thing. So, for example, in the middle, I consider Wheel of Time because we have magic systems that are not fully restricted by rules. They have some rules, but for example, the Aes Sedai seem to be able to do pretty much anything as long as they know the weaves. So there is a limitation, and then there's a limitation of their own innate power. They cannot do super complex weaves if they themselves are not strong in the power. So there's those type of limitations, and then of course there are other rules like you can have certain items to augment your powers, things like that. Now, two authors that I consider excel really well in terms of magic systems are Brandon Sanderson and then Kate Jemison. Very different, and I think that's the brilliant thing about these two authors and comparing them is that Brandon Sanderson, we know his magic systems, they are incredible. He is famous for them. I mean, we have Mistborn, we have Stormlight Archive, Warbreaker, we have Elantris, all different with very different rules, very different limitations, and that's exciting because every new book that you read from them, you know that it will be different, it will have different dynamics. But another thing is that you know that this magic system is fully integrated into the world, which is a very important part because you can't have a magic system that is just used by our heroes and it does not affect the world around them. For example, Stormlight Archive. We know that the people that are able to use their magic, they get blue eyes. And in the story, the people with blue eyes are considered nobility. So that is how a magic system can affect the culture of a world and even the world itself. So you can see in that example how just one aspect, which is having blue eyes, can change very much so the dynamic of the story. Same thing with Mistborn. Usually the people that have the powers in Mistborn are nobles or the bastards of nobles. And therefore, you won't see many just people that are in the lower classes having powers. And of course, that shifts the dynamic because the people that are in power have power. So that kind of just makes everything worse. Whereas, for example, in N.K. Jemison's books, the Broken Earth series, you have magic that is associated with being able to harness heat around you and control earthquakes type of thing, which makes the people that are able to use this magic super powerful. They are kind of like nuclear bombs because if you upset them, they can literally destroy the city. So they are enslaved and they are used as weapons or as tools in the world. So as you can see, these two examples, they have magic systems that are capable of immense destruction. However, they are included into the world, they are integrated very differently. One is considered an ability, the other one is considered a slave. And none of these are wrong. Both of them are really great because they show how magic integrates into the world and how it changes the dynamics, especially for the plot. And I think that is vital for these type of magic systems, is not only for them to be great, to be original, but also to be integrated into the world and help the plot move forward. And of course, characters as well, but just I think this part of the world building really helps the plot itself, just to create tensions, elevate stakes, things like that. After this, I think one other aspect of world building that is quite important is the history of the world. Because if you just have a world that just started, you don't feel like the world is as real as it could be. And history can help characters a lot because it shapes how their culture is, it shapes how they themselves are. And I'm going to give some examples and you'll see that what I mean, and you'll think, oh, maybe he is right actually, because history, I know it might sound super boring, hearing about dates or about things that happened in the past that don't really matter in the present of the story, but I think that actually those type of information just feeds a bit that curiosity and just makes you feel like you are more in the world than before. So the two examples that I want to talk about in this section are George R. R. Martin and Ken Liu. George R. R. Martin with The Song of Ice and Fire. We all know Westeros. We know that it has a huge extent of history. There is a book just talking about one of the houses, how they traveled and installed themselves in Westeros and then conquered everything. So there's a whole lot of history. And throughout the books of A Song of Ice and Fire, you do get fed this information little by little of just some episodes in history, some history of some houses, how things integrate with each other. And I think that is really important because the world then feels lived in, it feels realer, and you know now why certain people, certain characters behave the way they behave. For example, the Lannisters, they are super proud. You get that information from learning not only from other characters, but also just to hear their story, how their house grew in power and amassed a whole lot of gold and became one of the most important houses in Westeros. Another example, the Targaryen. You know that this house has been a conqueror type of house that just was able to destroy everything in their path and just rule over everything, which until very recently, until the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, they basically lost everything. However, they were raised to believe that they are the owners of Westeros, and therefore their perspective on it can be explained by their past. And you wouldn't understand why they behave the way they behave if we didn't have all that history. So I think this part of world building is really important to build a character because, again, our past and the past of our ancestors is really important to show who we are today. And I think Ken Liu shows the history of the world in a very different way. With Ken Liu and the Dandelion Dynasty, we go into these big blocks of history, but it's just like one episode of a certain person or a certain area of that world, and you get to know a whole bunch of it right away. And that gives you a whole different perspective on why a character is the way they are or what is happening in the present that was actually influenced from the past. And I think these two ways of providing history are quite different, but they kind of achieve the same effect. Whereas with Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire, we get fed a bit of history here and there, and it's almost like pieces of a puzzle that you start building up and you reach the end of the series, or whatever there is, by completing this image and having a full picture of Westeros. Ken Liu just gives you a whole meal of history, lets you read it, and then says, okay, now let's go back to the present, and I bet you will see things in a different perspective now due to that information that I just gave you. So I think those are two brilliant authors that were able to provide world building at a very high quality due to the history that they provide to the world. Of course, there are other aspects of the world building that are also good, but I think they excel at providing the history of it. And the last segment of world building that I think is also super important and not many people are able to do it well is the world itself. And what do I mean by this? I want to read a story where the world feels like it's real, feels like it's lived in and that it's complex and has everything to actually see myself going in there. And I think there's two ways of doing this. Either you create a whole world that is huge and you get to explore all these different areas and figure out why they're different, why the world is so big, or you hyper focus into just this one place, but you do it so well that it feels like I know it from the back of my hand and I could pinpoint which street is which. And so, for example, on the aspect of a big world that gets explored really well, I'm just going to mention Wheel of Time. It's not the example that I want to mention, but I'm just going to say Wheel of Time did this very well. We have a huge continent. We even have a different continent that we barely know anything about, that we don't explore. But the continent that we do, it's full of kingdoms. Every kingdom is different. People have different cultures. They behave differently due to that culture, also partially due to the history of that continent itself. But I think that the world is really explored in minute detail across different books. Of course, we have 15 books and we have multiple characters traveling through these countries, which allows us to do this. But the two examples that I want to talk about are China Mieville and Terry Pratchett, because I think they do the opposite really well as well, which is hyperfixate in one thing and make it so that that thing is lived in and it feels so real. I mean, Terry Pratchett, let's start with Terry Pratchett. He has some books where we get to explore the Discworld, and we explored quite a lot, so I think he also does that well. But when we explore Ankh-Morpork, which is one particular city, I think that city is done really well, and I can picture pretty much everything. The city itself feels like a character that we get to experience the story with. Not only because of the way it is, all the different dynamics that exist between the characters and the different institutes that exist there. I think Terry Pratchett also has a very particular writing style that allows this feeling that the city itself is a character. Whereas China Mieville, I think he has two books that I really enjoyed for this aspect. One of them is On London, the other one is Perdido Street Station. I think he describes places in a way that feel real, even though his writing is very weird in the sense that it's like a dark, mysterious vibe. I cannot really explain. I think he is very unique in what he writes, and I definitely recommend you read at least On London if you want a more younger audience, or Perdido Street Station for a more adult story. I think Perdido Street Station, especially the amount of different peoples that exist, their interactions, how the city felt like, I don't know, a New York City, but fantastical, without the skyscrapers in the same way. It's very hard to explain, but I thought it was amazing. And I think that describing the world like this helps so much for the character and the plot together to be propelled forward, because the city creates a huge ambience. So for example, if you're writing a story that is mystery, you want a city that is like foggy, that is darkish, that has a lot of mystery on a lot of unanswered questions. Whereas if you want a city that is more happier, or that you're writing a story that is supposed to be funny, like Terry Pratchett, then you build a city that is livelier, that has a lot of quirks in itself. So building your world really needs to be coherent with the story that you're trying to write. And I think that is very, very hard to do, because it's just small details here and there on how you describe something, how the city itself is built by you. So I think those two examples are really good at what they do in that hyper-focused manner. Whereas if we get to explore continents and things like that, you have to go in a more George Martin or Robert Jordan, Wheel of Time type of thing. And that kind of summarizes what I wanted to talk about world building. I hope you agree with me and I hope you enjoy, and comment down below more books that are doing this well. So for example, I didn't mention, but The Shadow of What Was Lost that I read recently, you can check the review here on the channel. I think that was also an amazing world building, although it is the first book of the trilogy, so I want to explore it more before I say, okay, it's an amazing example of world building. But one thing that I did not mention is how world building can also be integrated into the world by the magic system, or just by the history of the world. Because for example, N.K. Jemisin, one of the details that I loved the most was how the biology of the planet was adapted to it, because it's a story where there's a lot of catastrophes that happen quite regularly, and nature has adapted to it to continue surviving, because that's what nature does. I mean, George Martin also, not George Martin, but Brandon Sanderson also does this by creating nature that is adapted to the worlds that he creates. And I think that is really just like a small detail, but for me, that does this. I mean, I'm a biologist, so I really look into nature and how authors integrate that into their books. I think they did it brilliantly. Sometimes, I mean, it's too fantastical, but that is fantasy, which I don't mind at all. So I think that is all I want to say today. If you're new, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and I shall be seeing you on Thursdays and Saturdays. See you soon.